Hello everyone, happy September. This is Lee up here in the intro, just letting you know that we're dropping an extra little episode today. We do not have a new episode of History is Gay for you today, but we do have the first episode of a brand new, really wonderful podcast called Transcripts. Transcripts is a new podcast that puts the transgender movement in context, using oral histories from the Tretter Transgender Oral History Project at the University of Minnesota. The hosts, Andrea Jenkins and Myrl introduce listeners to the trans activists who are changing our world. We really wanted to share this out as some really wonderful other trans folks who are creating media and content. I hope that you enjoyed this first episode, and please go check it out and subscribe. Also, bonus, it's produced by Cass Adair, who is one of the folks who has edited this show in the past. So go support queer trans folks, go support queer trans podcasts, and we will see you here in the feed in a few weeks for a new episode of History is Gay. Until then, stay queer and stay curious.
It pops in my head. It was a clip of Nina Simone sitting at a table. She said, "I've never felt liberation, but in this moment, I'm around other Black people. I feel liberated."
That's LaSaya Wade. She's talking to oral historian Myrl in fall 2019, and she's talking about freedom.
It's always going to be a bill that needs to be paid. It's always going to be a water bill that's being turned off. It's always going to be a car note that you missed. It's always going to be that particular stress. But I feel liberated when I'm around other Black people. I feel liberated when I'm around other trans people.
From the Tretter Transgender Oral History Project, this is Transcripts, a new podcast series about how trans activists are changing the world.
What do we want? Transgender! When do we want it? Yeah!
You want to talk about trans issues, you want to talk about trans rights and gay rights. And,
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's like, it's okay for you to be kind of like a queer.
Now there are some incredible trans women of color activists up here with me. Yes, let's hear it for them.
The state of transness in America, the state of Blackness in America, the state of sexuality in America, everything that I care about, housing, discrimination, education.
Sharing space, sharing stories, sharing experience. And that is the work. That is the work that I'm so honored to stand here and lift up for you today.
My name is Andrea Jenkins.
And I'm Myrl. I'm the one who spoke with LaSaya, who you heard at the top of the show, and all the other voices you'll hear in this episode. I work on an oral history project where I collect stories of trans activists from all over the U.S.
I actually started that oral history project back in 2015. I wanted to hear the stories of trans people in their own words and preserve those stories for other people to learn from.
And I'm so glad you did, because the stories are amazing. And those stories are especially important right now because so many trans people are dreaming of a new world, one without gender discrimination or racism or economic injustice.
And we're figuring out what exactly it's going to take to get there. We've been asking folks, what are the tools you're using to make change? Who's leading the struggle? And how in the world are people getting enough money to live and do all of this work?
So in this pilot episode, we're going to tackle a question that sounds simple, but is actually really big. Is life actually getting better for trans people?
Like, it's not just LaSaya's vision of liberation, of being around people like her, other Black people, other trans people that got us thinking. It's also what she was saying about her daily struggles.
It's always going to be a bill that needs to be paid. It's always going to be a water bill that's being turned off.
So when I interviewed LaSaya, I asked her, what about the fact that things seem to be getting better for some people?
What's your sense of that paradox that, like, at the same time we have this visibility, there's also been more Black trans women killed last year than I think ever in my lifetime. How do you explain that? What do you think is going on?
We allowed our enemies to know where we're at. We have allowed our enemies to know where we're at.
This answer was so compelling that I wanted to back up and learn more. How did we arrive at a place where some trans people, especially white trans folks, people like me, think of things as getting better, but life is actually getting a lot more dangerous for Black trans women like Lisaya?
To answer that question, we talked to so many different people, and we want you to hear their stories directly from them. You'll hear folks describing the barriers that they face, but you'll also hear what they are doing to change things.
That decision to try to change things, to devote your life to a larger struggle, it isn't always an easy choice. Activism wasn't exactly Lisaya's plan A. For a long time, she was just trying to live her life.
I was director of communications in Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee, at Bell South when it was slowly switching over to AT&T.
Down for the price, plus digital satellite TV with more HD channels than cable, all for under $99 a month. Bell South. Call today.
Good job after I graduated college. I'm like, oh, I nailed one.
She wasn't out as trans at work.
As a trans feminine person, it's easier to live as a stealth person, and especially trying to live a healthy life or also live a wealthy life. And what I mean by wealthy is going through school, getting a thriving job, not just a surviving job, but a thriving job, a good career.
But about a year into the job, she rolled into work after she had been out the night before at the club.
You know, I'm still young. I'm still vivacious. I wanted to have fun.
Watching me like TV. I'm one of the best, you don't believe me.
So I came back to work that following Monday with my stuff on my desk packed up.
One of Lisaya's cis gay coworkers had seen her at the club, and from there he figured out she was trans. Then he outed her to the rest of the office.
The coworker that wanted my job told my boss at that time that I was a trans person. And it was multiple layers to that, right? I was a Black person in a high position at a company that is not really known for a Black person to be that high in a position that I was in. And also I was a trans person. And then they fired me for non-disclosure of my transness.
Lisaya was fired for being Black, trans, and powerful. And there was nothing she could do. She was in Tennessee, where there aren't many protections for workers.
They fire you because your hair is purple and they don't like the color of your hair. So in the moments, I was depressed. I'm like, what am I going to do? How dare they treat me this way? I was a good worker. Then I was just like, how can I take my language and my education and take it to the next level for communities, my community that is not seen? So I joined Black Lives Matter. And then ever since then, I took off.
Joining Black Lives Matter was how Lisaya found activism. And that transformation from being fired to becoming an activist, that's a familiar story for the trans folks we spoke with.
I'm just literally coming to work, doing my job, and I don't know if I'm going to be fired or not.
That's Diamond Styles. By the time she was fired from her job, her life was already shaped by racism and discrimination.
My mother had been caught up in the prison industrial complex. As a Black woman, she was one of those super predators.
We should probably explain super predator for folks who weren't around in 1992.
Okay, yes. Super predator refers to a now discredited theory from the 1990s. The idea that some people were just naturally violent and lacked empathy. Most of those so-called super predators were Black.
The concept was made popular to the nation by the Clinton administration. They used that terminology in campaigns, ultimately passing a racist tough-on-crime bill in 1994.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel, and the president has asked the
That fake science was part of a trend of mass incarceration of Black and brown people. People like Diamond's mom.
And so she got caught up in that, and I got custody of my brother. And so I'm at home, a single trans woman with an 11-year-old.
As a Black trans woman, Diamond knew she had even more stacked against her.
When I went to college, first trans person to go to Jackson State University, I didn't plan to go there. I didn't know what the history was. I was stuck in Walnut Grove, Mississippi with my mom, who was going through an addiction. And I wanted to get out of this country rural town because this is not fun for me. And so the only way I could go is to go to college.
But living in a male dorm wasn't safe for Diamond either.
People were trying to throw scalding hot water on me in the dorm, trying to burn me. I'm sitting here. I have no power in this situation. I'm just reacting to everything that's happening to me.
She hoped that leaving college and moving out of a male dorm, things would get better. But
I worked for Hewlett Packard, and when my transness came out, one of my family members worked there, like a distant cousin, and she told people that I was trans.
Her coworkers started harassing her.
One of the supervisors lost their keys, and they gave me the keys to give it to the supervisor so they can take pictures of us interacting with each other and make fun of him. I didn't have any political recourse. I didn't have any legal recourse because of the state that I lived in. We didn't have the protection for trans people. And so I was forced into survival sex work at the time. And, it just changed the trajectory of my life.
Sex work is something that some trans women do to make money. But it wasn't that Diamond wanted to. She felt isolated. But then she found something that changed her life. YouTube.
Hey, what's up? This is your girl, Diamond Styles. Hey, what's up? This is your girl, Diamond. How are you? Now, some of you may know me. And I wasn't trying to be an activist, but because of those situations and because of technology, I started to be a YouTuber. They see your personality, your smile, all that good stuff. They see all of that. That's what they are attracted to. And because I was a little bit older in my transition, I was 26 at the time, but I had been living my truth since 13, 14. And so at the time, a lot of people, their videos were about, I was on T for 3 months. I was on T for 6 months. These are my surgery results. These are my top surgery results. This is my FFS result. It was more about the physical, but because I had already physically transitioned years ago, my narratives were about just relationships and stories. You have to create your own ideals of beauty. And stick to it. Because if you have your own ideals of beauty and your own ideas of where you should be and what you should look like, nobody can come around and smack it out of your head. And everybody was like, wow, they kind of related to it. So that's how it started. A lot of times people live up to movie stars and Eurocentric ideals of beauty that you never can live up to. You feel what I'm saying? Got like 4.5 million views, and it just grew from that. I felt like every time they talked to trans people, all they had to talk about was the bathroom issue. I care about things more than the bathroom issue. So I was like, people started to say I was an activist, and I really wasn't for sure if that hat fit, because at the time I was still in sex work. I was doing all the non-respectable stuff. And I was like, I'm not no activist. That's for the goody two-shoes. That's for the goody two-shoes. That's not me.
But the more Diamond worked in activism, the more she realized it actually was her.
And so what this last 5 years has taught me in being in this work is that you have the power to build community to keep you safe. You have the power to build community to give you the support that you need so you can do the things you want to do. And if you build that infrastructure and that family and that community, that can be a part of your support system to be able to fight when you need to fight, give you the power to change your own trajectory in your life. And so that's literally what activism has done for me. It's like you want to be that structure for somebody else, and you want the people in your life to be that structure for you.
Ricky Mananzala is another person who's been that support structure for others. He was inspired to build community power by watching his mom, an immigrant domestic worker, struggle with xenophobia and racism on the job.
Definitely remember her coming home from work, tired, exhausted, angry, frustrated, and hearing that things just weren't right.
When he got older, his queerness became yet another challenge that his family had to face.
When I was a teenager, I came out as queer, and that was something that was really important to me and it's a part of my identity. And although it was challenging to come to that conclusion, what was more challenging was that my parents didn't accept that, and so I lost their support. And that sent me on a different path. As a teenager, I had to quickly figure out life as a ward of the state, as someone that needed to finish high school and hopefully move on to other ways of taking care of myself. And so that fire in my belly, I think, attached to my personal experience, set me on this path of believing that if there are challenges, not only in my personal life, but in the world, that there are responsibility to challenge them and to make change.
But what does that change look like? When I asked her how things had changed in the last few decades, Lasaya had a pretty frank answer.
It's a lot of assimilating politics. And what I mean by assimilating politics is, as a Black revolutionary, as a Black person that deals with Black politics and Black power and Black liberation, we think that if we want to be a part of society, we're still using our master's tools to be a part of society that deem us not normal.
In the U.S., being in a, quote, normal society means being in white society. A lot of trans people have this idea that if we get more visibility, we'll do better. And some of that has worked for people like me.
But we heard very different stories from the folks working on the front lines of Black and trans people of color-led movements.
You have to understand that visibility does not change the heart and minds of the people. It doesn't give anybody any survival mechanisms. So Pose, amazingly brilliant for sharing narratives and being in people's homes week after week. They're doing an amazing job. Love them.
Pose is an FX show about the African-American and Latinx ballroom scene in the 1980s. It's got trans producers like Janet Mock and Our Lady J, and a lot of people like it, including trans people.
But if I'm still in Texas or Indiana and I'm getting fired and I don't have the legal recourse to protect myself against workforce discrimination, it doesn't matter if everybody's seen this on the TV because I don't have the protections in policy. The normal, typical social safety nets that a cis person has access to that we literally don't have access to. So say you're down on your luck and you're unsheltered, okay? A cis person can go to the shelters in the city. When I was homeless, I couldn't go to the cisgender women's shelter because they're uncomfortable and whatever rules that they have. I couldn't go to the male shelter because that's a liability for them. Like, they literally asked me on the phone, can you take your breast off? On the phone, well, if you can't take them off, then you can't come here. Went to the LGBT, went to them, and they said, well, our funding only covers people with HIV. Are you positive? No, we can't help you. So the cisgender ones and the LGBT ones couldn't help me. Now, because of the work that we've done, the LGBT one now is open for all. But in the time that I needed it, the normal social safety nets that I could go to, that a cis person could go to, I didn't have access to them. And they weren't safe places for me.
Trying to raise the visibility of criminalization and police brutality and gentrification as an LGBT issue was an uphill battle. To try to get support from our other LGBT movement allies that maybe had more resources or that we thought should be like paying attention to these issues as just as relevant as gay marriage.
Like Diamond, Ricky found that even LGBT organizations weren't much help when he was kicked out of his home.
We have kind of two parallel LGBT movements, one of which at that time was very, very deep in the gay marriage movement. And the other one was the rest of us, which was intersectional justice movements. We didn't necessarily identify with the LGBT movement because it wasn't really speaking to our most immediate needs.
Even in supposedly progressive New York City, mainstream organizations were paying lots of attention to marriage equality and not so much to trans people experiencing hunger or homelessness.
It'll be a statement on racial justice or racial equity. And then when you look at their actual programmatic work, their campaigns and advocacy were largely focused on very, very narrow issues that certainly impacted LGBT people, but those ones that had the least to lose.
That's how Ricky started questioning whether the strategy that mainstream LGBT movements had used to win legal recognition, get some nice-looking spokespeople, go on TV, convince straight people that we're just like you, was that really a good idea? Maybe it could actually backfire.
I've heard countless stories about like a trans training happening in a police department and then the police in that department more easily identifying trans people to harass.
That's Dean Spade, founder of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project in New York, an organization that offers legal support to trans and gender nonconforming people. He argues that queer and trans visibility can cover up the fact that inequality is still growing.
Civil rights legislation doesn't really work to resolve systemic harm against hated groups. It hasn't for any of the hated groups that are supposedly covered. Conditions continue to worsen for all of those groups.
In other words, marriage equality and anti-discrimination laws may make it seem like things are better for LGBT people, but they don't make poor people less poor or get prisoners out of prison.
Rents are higher, pollution is worse, schools are worse, people work more hours for less money.
So for Dean, that means that just changing laws isn't the answer. If resources are still being hoarded by some people, then the rest of us are less free, no matter what the law says.
Even though the connection and community that Diamond has created through her media presence is incredibly valuable, especially for young people, Diamond pretty much agrees.
Those key bottom line factors to be able to eat, sleep, and chase your dreams, those are the changes that can keep trans women off the streets, in housing, in good health care, not just visibility.
Still, Diamond Styles has hope that legal protections and anti-discrimination laws can improve the lives of people like her.
You get people who are in the trenches and in those back rooms who are putting policies to work that protect us and are not creating this perpetual cycle where we don't have the care.
But Lysia Wade, the former Bell South employee, she says trans people need to work outside the system.
I want to see more of us building our own power instead of trying to be a part of their power. Assimilation ain't gonna do nothing but try to disempower the trans community in a way of, oh, now we're part of society, we need to forget about the movement. And also that's a white lens, right, of assimilating. As a person that is not of white culture or tries to maneuver from white culture, we need to realize assimilation is not healthy or good for the Black body, period. It never was. It means death, automatically. So what does it look like for us to build our own system? What does it look like for us to build our own power? What does it look like for us to build our own methods of funds that we tunnel back into our own community?
What does it look like to build that power ourselves? If trying to be visible in the mainstream, showing the powerful that we are just like them, if that doesn't work, what does? To find out, we spoke with Gabriel Foster. Like Ricky, Gabriel had started doing activism pretty early in his life.
After I dropped out of high school, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I just dove in and I said yes to everything.
That say yes to everything attitude meant that Gabriel was already a pretty seasoned activist by the time he grew up and moved to New York City. But one day, he was out in the middle of a protest when he literally ran into someone who would change his whole world view.
We march today to show the depth of the community solidarity and commitment to end discrimination against trans and gender nonconforming people.
We were at the Trans Day of Action March and Rally, which happens every year, where like trans and non-binary folks and allies and queer folks and lots of different people fill the streets of New York.
What do we want? Trans justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Trans justice! When do we want it? Now!
And this woman named Karen Piddleman. She was trying to talk to me while we're like marching. I'm really angry. I'm carrying these signs around and like there's a lot of feelings. And she's like asking me, she's like, I have an idea. And I was like, what? she's like really trying to have this conversation with me. And I'm like, what? I can't, I couldn't like give her my full attention.
No justice, no peace, no transphobic police.
And she's like, I just want to like put money into a paper bag and I want to drive around the country in a van and give it to trans communities so they get the money more directly. And I was like, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. I had never heard of anyone in my whole life talk about like just giving trans people money.
So that was Gabriel's first meeting with Karen Piddleman. Karen Piddleman's a writer and poet and the lead singer of a queer country band, Karen and the Sorrows. She's also part of a movement of people working to give away their inherited wealth. And although Karen isn't trans herself, she recognized that trans people were on the front lines of social justice struggles that she wanted to support. So eventually, Gabriel and Karen did have another conversation, this time not in the middle of a march.
I had no background in philanthropy. I think I didn't even know what that word meant for a long time. But she was like, you've worked with a lot of communities and you know folks kind of like around the country. And then she brought her checkbook, but she also brought a lot of time and dedication and worked for, 60 to 80 hours a week for at least 3 years.
And that's how the Trans Justice Funding Project was born.
And man, I am so proud that I was able to work with Gabriel and Karen because the idea sparked something that would end up supporting hundreds and thousands of trans people and organizations.
And now we are moving into our 8th year. The first year we made grants. We were able to raise a little over $55,000.
$55,000 wouldn't be a lot of money for big LGBT rights organizations. It's a tiny fraction of the budget for a big mainstream organization like the Human Rights Campaign. The organization that gave out all those little yellow and blue equal sign stickers.
But for trans organizations, trans people, that's a lot of money. And today, the Trans Justice Funding Project has funded hundreds of small budget, trans-led community groups. The kind of groups that provide care and support for trans migrants, trans youth, indigenous trans people, undocumented trans people, trans veterans, trans people of color, just really all sorts of transgender identified people.
And not just in big cities or so-called progressive places. Trans groups in Alabama and Texas and Montana and South Carolina have all gotten funding too. It's a big, coordinated mutual aid project where money goes to those most in need outside of the big nonprofits.
And what's so beautiful is that it is trans people who choose who to give that money away to.
We bring 6 individuals together from across the country who are trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming, and they are the ones that make the grant-making decisions. So they read all of the applications, they get online and they vote and they share their notes, and then we bring them to New York to meet for a very long, very rigorous, very emotional weekend to determine who the grantees will be and how much they'll be awarded. And we use community folks who are actually doing this work every day as the experts who know what's best and give them the power to make decisions around where money should go. As staff, I have no say about where the money goes, which is not easy, but that's our politic. That's us practicing that politic about it being fully community-led.
And unlike most grant-making organizations, the Trans Justice Funding Project doesn't just give money to organizations with official nonprofit status.
We know some of the most radical and critical and amazing work doesn't happen in offices and doesn't happen because the government says it should happen. People do a lot of work at kitchen tables and community centers and parks or wherever they can meet, and it doesn't have to be validated by the government to matter.
So This isn't about fundraising. It's about what people do when they rely on each other instead of on mainstream politics.
In the absence of social services and support from the mainstream movement, trans people of color are keeping each other safe and are doing the work. Today, Diamond Styles is the executive director of Black Trans Women, Inc., and she builds her work around foundational Black feminist principles.
Black feminists have already laid out foundations like this. Black women have never had a vision of liberation that didn't include everybody. If you built your policy around caring for me, regardless of what I got going on, out of all the things, out of all the labels, trans, Black, woman, if I was disabled, if I was positive, if you revolved around caring about my humanity, regardless of the label, I just think that by centering us, it just pulls everybody up.
Pulling everybody up. It's a big task. And we don't know if we'll live to see the end of things like incarceration or policing.
But we can see glimpses of liberation already in the work that trans people are doing right now.
Like in Lasiyah Wade's new job. After she was fired from Bell South, Lasiyah began organizing a direct action protest group in Chicago called the Transgender Liberation Collective, TLC.
It was a complete blackout. No one wanted to say anything. Everyone refused to say anything. And I was angry. I was livid. Like, you say you want liberation, but you exclude trans people from that liberation because you're not talking about everyone's liberation. You're talking about your liberation and what your liberation looks like. That's not what liberation is.
Lasiyah was angry because Black trans women in Chicago were being murdered. She was angry because no one was doing anything about it. Not the city, and not the big, white, gay and lesbian organizations either.
So TLC said, fuck this. We need to sit out and do something.
The collective banded together with organizations like Black Lives Matter Chicago and Jewish Voices for Peace. Together, they put together a march to call attention to the murders of Black trans women in the city.
I'm getting chills right now because the Midwest showed up and showed out in Chicago.
Trans lives matter! Black trans lives matter! Black trans lives matter! Black trans lives matter!
We had over 2,000 people in downtown Chicago, below 0-degree weather, marching for trans people. And that's where BSA was created. That's when we knew that BSA needed to be in Chicago.
The BSA, the Brave Space Alliance, that's Lasiyah's job now, running her own activism organization in Chicago.
Say that about a bitch. There it was. Brave Space Alliance. And then we started building.
Today, the Brave Space Alliance is a Black-led, trans-led LGBTQ center located on Chicago's South Side. It holds events and support groups, helps people find jobs and get training, and even runs a free produce program.
During the first few weeks of the COVID-19 crisis, the Brave Space Alliance delivered bags of food to over 1,000 households and gave out over $40,000 in direct mutual aid through the Trans Relief Fund.
And through all of this work, Lasiyah brings a clear vision of the future.
To center trans people, building leadership of Black and brown trans people, and then everyone else can come and join the liberation.
It's worth saying again, that's a really different strategy than the mainstream LGBT movements have used. Those movements, mostly led by white, wealthier people, are built on the idea of finding LGBT people who are most like other people in power, except for this one difference. then they're making sure everybody sees that we're just like you.
But what Black Trans Women, Inc. and Brave Space Alliance are doing, it's not about centering people who are the most mainstream.
We want BSA to be understood as a method of liberation, and we're centering the lives of the most marginalized within our community.
So even while full liberation for trans people might be a ways off, this Black feminist vision about centering the most marginalized in your activism, it isn't just theory. It's happening now.
And it's already changing the world around us.
So for the next 6 episodes, we're going to bring you voices of the people doing the work and offer you tools for how you can join in too, whoever you are.
We're going to ask big questions.
What would a world without transphobia look like?
What would the world look like if trans people were able to make decisions about their bodies, their livelihoods, their relationships?
What would it take for Black trans people to live out liberation? To live joyfully?
My hope is that people click in their mind how helping us build this movement to where we're free to do what we want to do helps women, helps Black people, helps same gender loving people, and help other gender nonconforming people. If you get us free and liberate us, it liberates everybody else to do whatever they want to do. If we have agency over our body, that means that you should be able to get an abortion because you have agency over your body. And if you have policies that protect us doing whatever we want with our body, it should be a policy that protects you doing whatever you want with your body.
So these days, LaSaya isn't angry anymore.
A lot of people look at me like, why are you smiling? Ain't you supposed to be angry? But I'm next to you. Why I need to be angry? Why I need to be sad about it? I need to figure out this particular type of joy that I'm feeling in this particular moment because I'm standing beside someone that I probably would never been able to stand beside. Because in this particular madness, I'm connecting to you.
This is Transcripts, a podcast from the Tretter Trans Oral History Project. We're a program of the University of Minnesota, and I am Andrea Jenkins.
And I'm Myrl. And there's more to come. After all, trans activism, it touches so many aspects of our world.
It's actually literally everything. It is access to homeless shelters. It is having alternatives outside of the police. It's like, it feels endless to me.
We'll have episodes that follow all of these threads: criminalization and policing, medical systems, violence, while also keeping our eyes focused on the goal of freedom for everyone. We'll be on hiatus for a little while we're putting together those episodes. But in the meantime, there's a lot of ways to support us and the organizations we spotlighted here at our website. You can find us at bit.ly/transcriptspod.
At that URL, you can also find the full interviews with all of our oral history participants, as well as additional material to help you explore concepts and themes related to this episode.
One last note. While we're on break, we want to bring you a sampler of trans podcasts through our channel. There's a whole world of trans audio out there on every imaginable topic. So if you subscribe to our feed, you'll get one episode of a new show every other week.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll speak with you again soon.
The lead producer of Transcripts is me, Cassius Adair. Myrl Beam is the senior project scholar and also a producer. Rachel Matson is the managing producer, and Myra Billenfibs is the production assistant. Sound design in this episode is by Ariana Martinez, and musical direction is by Casper. You heard music by Jupiter Gray and Carl X. Go support these amazing trans artists wherever you get your music. And also, go check out the visual artist Faye Hernandez, who designed our podcast logo. Special thanks to Vidya Araband, Hideo Higashibaba, Juliet Heinley, Kelly Jones, Anya Kongiza, Lavelle Ridley, Irissa Apentaku, and Tug Woodstock. Thanks also to Tom Callahan at Sensitive Visuals and to Karen and the Sorrows for additional sound in this episode. The Transcripts podcast is a project of the Tretter Transgender Oral History Project, which is based at the University of Minnesota Libraries. Funding for this podcast came from the Tawani Foundation and the Minnesota Humanities Innovation Lab.
I know I might not be able to see your liberation in your time, but I'm seeing my liberation right now.